Imagine a building that watches you before you reach its gates. Not the way a person watches, the way a geometry watches. Brick laid with such precision that every angle feels calculated for maximum effect. Iron bars spaced just so. This is Pentonville Prison on Caledonian Road in North London. And in 1842, the British government spent £84,186, 12 shillings, and 2 pence to build it. That's roughly £9 million in today's money. They called it a model prison, a machine designed not just to hold criminals, but to reshape their souls through isolation. 520 cells, each one 13 feet by 7 feet by 9 feet, each one containing a single man, alone, silent, separated from every other human being by walls thick enough to turn neighbors into ghosts. The Victorians believed they'd invented scientific punishment, rational cruelty, a system so perfectly engineered that it would cure crime through loneliness. They were wrong, but the building they constructed is still standing, still operating, still grinding through populations nearly 2 centuries later. And the cost of that mistake can't be measured in pounds and pence. Today, we're opening the files on London's spirit-shattering solitary labyrinth. We're going cell by cell, year by year, death by death, through the machine that was supposed to save criminals and ended up breaking them instead. This is the story of Pentonville, and it's darker than you think. There's a building on Caledonian Road in North London that watches you before you reach its gates. Not the way a person watches, the way a geometry watches. Symmetry that feels deliberate, purposeful, cold. Brick laid with the kind of precision that suggests someone calculated every angle for maximum effect. Iron bars spaced just so. Windows positioned to catch light but never to give warmth. You stand on the pavement and the shape of it presses against your chest. It's not hostile exactly. It's indifferent. Which is worse, this is Pentonville Prison, and it was never meant to be just a building. It was meant to be an idea that could be copied, a blueprint, a machine designed not to hold bodies but to reshape them, to take a criminal and apply pressure, measured, systematic, scientifically justified pressure, until something fundamental changed inside him. Or until he broke. The Victorians called it a model prison. They were proud of that word. Model. It meant exportable, scalable, repeatable, something you could build once, study, perfect, and then stamp out across the empire like coins from a mint. They wanted to prove that reform could be engineered, that morality could be manufactured, that if you controlled the environment with enough rigor, you could control the soul. They were wrong about that last part. But they were right about one thing. The model worked, just not the way they thought it would. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the walls went up. Before the first prisoner felt the weight of silence pressed down on him like a lid. Back to the moment when someone looked at an empty plot of land and saw an opportunity to build something unprecedented, something rational, something that would make other nations take notice and say, yes, this is how you manage deviance. This is how you transform punishment into science. It starts with a question that sounds simple but isn't. What do you do with people who break the law? The old answer, the Georgian answer, the medieval answer, was chaos. Jails that were more marketplace than institution. Debtors mixing with murderers. Children in the same space as hardened criminals. Filth, disease, corruption, violence as ambient conditions. You paid for better treatment if you had money. You rotted if you didn't. The system wasn't a system at all. It was an accident that pretended to be justice. By the 1830s, Parliament looked at this mess and decided it needed replacing. Not reform. Replacement. Something clean. Something that could demonstrate Britain's capacity for rational governance. Something modern. The answer they arrived at was radical in its simplicity. Build a prison where every variable is controlled, where contamination, not just physical but moral, social, linguistic, is impossible, where a man can't corrupt another man because he never sees another man, where reformation happens not through brutality, but through order, through isolation, through the application of silence like a surgical tool. They called this the separate system, and Pentonville was going to be its cathedral. But cathedrals need architects, and this particular cathedral needed someone who understood pressure, someone who could think about human beings the way an engineer thinks about water flowing through pipes, someone trained to build order under impossible conditions, someone from the Royal Engineers. Captain Joshua Jebb was that person. Jebb wasn't a philosopher. He wasn't a reformer in the sense of someone motivated by passion or outrage. He was a builder, a military engineer who'd spent his career constructing fortifications, managing logistics, solving problems that involved weight, stress, materials, tolerances. He understood how structures held together, how forces distributed, how systems could be designed to channel movement, contain energy, prevent collapse. When the government asked him to design a prison, he approached it the same way he'd approach a barracks or a bridge, as a technical problem with a technical solution. The problem: how do you prevent men from influencing each other? How do you isolate, not just physically, but socially, intellectually, spiritually? How do you create an environment where every interaction can be monitored, where nothing happens outside of official knowledge, where the only relationship that matters is between prisoner and institution? Jebb's answer was architectural. A central hall, 4 wings radiating out from it like spokes on a wheel, each wing a corridor lined with cells, each cell identical, each cell designed to contain one man. The geometry was simple, but the implications were profound. If you stood in that central hall, you could see down every corridor simultaneously. Not into the cells themselves, that wasn't the point, but you could see the doors, the landings, the pathways. You could know that movement was happening according to plan, that no one was where they shouldn't be, that the schedule was being kept. This wasn't the panopticon. People make that mistake constantly. The panopticon was about vision turned inward, about prisoners never knowing if they were being watched, creating a kind of internalized surveillance. Bentham's fantasy. Pentonville was different. Pentonville was about visibility of infrastructure, about designing space so that control became automatic, so that the building itself enforced the rules without requiring constant intervention. It was a machine, and like any good machine, it was designed to run efficiently. But efficiency toward what end? This is where ideology enters the blueprint. This is where the cold geometry gets dressed up in moral language, because you can't just build a building and say, we're going to isolate men in boxes. You need a theory. You need justification. You need to convince Parliament, convince the public, convince yourselves that this isn't cruelty, that it's care. The theory they chose was seductive in its logic. Crime, they argued, is a social disease. It spreads through contact, through conversation, through the formation of what we might now call networks. A young offender arrives at a chaotic jail. He meets experienced criminals. They teach him, refine his methods, harden his identity. He leaves more dangerous than when he entered. The jail, instead of reforming, graduates him into a criminal class. Separate him, though. Remove the social element entirely. Force him into solitude, into reflection, into a space where the only voices he hears are his own thoughts and the official messages of reform delivered by chaplains, by wardens, by the authority figures who visit his cell. In that environment, without the contamination of peer influence, the theory goes, he can change. He can become penitent. The word itself, penitentiary, a place for penitence. Every architectural feature gets labeled with moral vocabulary. Ventilation isn't about air quality, it's about purity. The partitions separating exercise yards aren't about logistics. They're about enabling reflection without distraction. Silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of an opportunity to confront the self, to feel the weight of what you've done without the buffer of camaraderie or excuse-making. It's a beautiful theory, clean, self-contained, the kind of thing that sounds humane when you present it to a committee. You're not punishing. You're providing an environment for transformation. You're offering each man the chance to rebuild himself from the ground up, brick by brick, in the privacy of his own consciousness. The problem, of course, is that human beings aren't pipes. They don't behave predictably when you isolate them. But that discovery comes later. First comes the construction. First comes the measurement. 13 feet long, 7 feet wide, 9 feet high. These are the dimensions of a Pentonville cell. Write them down. 13 by 7 by 9. 91 square feet of floor space, 819 cubic feet of air. Enough room for a narrow bed, a small table, a stool, a hammock that can be folded away during the day, a water closet, a high window that lets in light but not a view, and walls thick enough to prevent sound from traveling cell to cell, walls that turn neighbors into abstractions. 520 cells. That's the design capacity. 520 men, each alone, never seeing each other's faces except when masked, never speaking except when spoken to, living according to a schedule so rigid that you could set a watch by it. The prison operates like a clock, every movement timed, every activity prescribed: wake, work, exercise, eat, chapel, sleep. The day divided into segments, each segment designed to fill time while preventing the formation of relationships. The logistics are intricate. The landings are narrow. Movement is controlled with precision. When prisoners leave their cells, they do so in a specific order, along specific routes, with specific spacing maintained between them. The corridors are designed to prevent even accidental eye contact. The partitions in the exercise yard ensure that men walk alone, in their own designated rectangles of space, breathing the same air but occupying separate realities. And here's the thing that should chill you. This design, 520 cells, each containing one isolated man, was considered a triumph, a model worth replicating. Officials from other countries came to study it, to take notes, to admire the cleanliness, the order, the absence of the chaos that characterized older institutions. They saw efficiency. They saw modernity. They saw a system that could be exported, scaled, adapted to local conditions while maintaining the core principle. One man, one cell, no contamination, no corruption, just the slow, methodical application of solitude as therapy. 520 is a manageable number when you have the staff, the budget, the commitment to maintain the system's integrity. But systems don't stay pure. They adapt, they grow, they respond to pressure from outside, and the pressure that would come, crowding, overuse, the transformation from model prison to local workhorse, that pressure would reveal something the designers never anticipated, that a box designed to hold one person in careful isolation becomes something entirely different when you start cramming in more, when resources stretch, when attention drifts. When the model becomes just another building in a system that prioritizes capacity over principle. But that comes later. Right now, in the early 1840s, the box is still theoretical. It exists on paper, in Jebb's precise engineering drawings, in the spreadsheets that justify the expenditure, in the promises made to Parliament that this institution will demonstrate Britain's enlightened approach to punishment, that it will reduce reoffending, that it will protect society while uplifting the criminal, that it will, in short, work. The cost is carefully calculated: £84,186, 12 shillings, 2 pence. That's the figure recorded for Pentonville's construction. Adjusted for inflation, you're looking at approximately £9 million in today's money, maybe more. The exact conversion depends on what you're measuring: labor costs, material costs, the value of capital, but the principle remains. This was expensive. This was an investment, not just in brick and iron, but in an idea, in the belief that design could manufacture compliance, that architecture could reshape behavior, that if you built the right kind of cage, the animal inside would learn to be something else. They begin construction on the 10th of April, 1840. 2 years later, it's finished. Pentonville opens. The first prisoners arrive. Officials tour the galleries. They admire the ventilation systems, the way light enters without providing distraction, the cleanliness, the sense of order. everything gleaming, everything new, everything functioning exactly as designed. And then they turn the machine on. The chapel becomes the symbolic heart of the enterprise. Not just a religious space, a demonstration of the prison's philosophy, because in a normal chapel people gather, they sit together, they sing, they share the experience of worship as community. That's the point of congregational prayer, the collective act, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself. Pentonville's chapel makes community impossible. The prisoners sit in separate cubicles, little wooden boxes arranged in tiers, all facing the pulpit, all visible to the chaplain and the warders, but not to each other. You can hear the sermon, you can hear the hymns, but you can't see the person next to you. You can't make eye contact, you can't communicate. You are alone, surrounded by others who are also alone, participating in what's supposed to be a communal ritual in perfect isolation. The prisoners have a name for these cubicles. They call them coffins. The name is perfect. You're upright, you're contained, you're visible to authority, but invisible to your peers. You exist in a state between presence and absence. You are there, in the chapel, but you are not part of the chapel. You are a witness to worship, not a participant in community. The chaplain's role becomes enormous. In the older jails, the chaplain was marginal. Religious services were optional, poorly attended, often chaotic. At Pentonville, the chaplain is a key operator. He visits each cell. He monitors each prisoner's progress. He files reports. He assesses attitudes. Is this man showing signs of penitence? Is he engaging with the moral instruction? Is he softening, or is he hardening? The chaplain isn't just a spiritual guide, he's a psychological assessor, a data point in the system's evaluation of whether the model is working. Daily attendance is mandatory. The chapel fills with the sound of a single voice, the chaplain's, and the rustle of men shifting in their wooden coffins, trying to find comfort where none exists. The sermon isn't about comfort, though. It's about confrontation, about forcing each man to examine his sins, his choices, his future, about using religion as a lever, a tool, a protocol. The prison's administrators see this as kindness, as providing spiritual care, as ensuring that even in isolation, prisoners have access to moral guidance. What they don't see or don't want to see is how it feels from inside the coffin, how it feels to be surrounded by the presence of others, but denied their humanity. To hear breathing, coughing, shuffling, and know that those sounds come from people you will never meet. To participate in a ritual designed for connection while experiencing only separation. This is the paradox at Pentonville's core. Every element of the design is justified as humane, better than the brutality of older systems, better than flogging, starvation, neglect. You have a clean cell, regular meals, work that occupies your time, access to education, religious instruction, fresh air, or at least fresher air than you'd get in a dungeon. The reformers genuinely believe they're building something better, something enlightened, something that replaces physical violence with psychological method. But psychological method is still violence. It's just harder to photograph, harder to quantify, harder to protest against because it hides behind the language of care. We're not torturing you, we're reforming you. We're giving you time to think, to change, to become better. And if that process feels like suffocation, if it feels like your identity is being slowly erased, if it feels like you're dying by inches in a box that smells of stone and silence and your own fear, well, that discomfort is part of the treatment. That discomfort is proof the system is working. The machine is switched on. The schedule takes hold. The building settles into its rhythm. Wake at a specific hour. Work in your cell. Picking oakum, stitching mailbags, whatever task has been assigned. Eat at a specific time. Exercise alone in your rectangle of yard. Chapel. More work. Another meal. Silence. Sleep. Repeat. The days blur together. The walls don't change. The routine doesn't vary. Time becomes thick. Viscous. something you move through rather than something that moves past you. And somewhere in that thickness, in that relentless sameness, the first cracks begin to appear. Not in the building. The building is solid. The building is functioning exactly as designed. The cracks appear in the men, in their minds, in the parts of them the architects never bothered to blueprint. 5:45 in the morning. That's when the day begins. Not with natural light, not with the slow drift from sleep to waking, with a bell. A mechanical sound that cuts through stone and iron and the fog of dreams. 5:45. The time doesn't change. The bell doesn't negotiate. You wake because the system says you wake. Your body learns to anticipate it, to jolt awake seconds before the sound arrives. That anticipation becomes its own kind of torture. You have 15 minutes. Make your bed. Fold your hammock if you sleep in one. Empty your night vessel. Stand ready. The routine is identical every morning. The order of tasks is prescribed. You don't get to choose. Choice is a luxury the system cannot permit because choice implies agency, and agency is what led you here in the first place. The prison's logic is simple. Your judgment failed you, so we remove the need for judgment. We make every decision for you. We control every variable. And in that control, you will find safety, structure, the possibility of change. 6 o'clock. Doors open. One at a time. Staggered. Officers moving down the landing with keys that jangle like warning bells. Your door opens. You step out. Eyes forward. No looking left. No looking right. The corridor is designed so you can't see into other cells even if you try. The angles are wrong. The sight lines are blocked. The geometry itself is a prison within the prison. You move. Walk to the exercise yard if it's your turn. Walk to the work area if that's where you're assigned. Walk to the chapel if it's Sunday. Walk. But walking isn't the word that captures it. Proceeding. Processing. Being moved through the system like a parcel through a sorting facility. You're wearing the prison uniform. Brown cloth that marks you, identifies you, removes individuality. Everyone looks the same. Everyone moves at the same pace. Everyone exists in the same state of monitored motion. Sound becomes the only form of communication, not speech. Speech is forbidden, but sound, boots on stone, the particular echo of different galleries, the creak of a cell door, the distant clang of a gate closing somewhere in the building's interior, the cough of another prisoner, disembodied, coming from nowhere specific, reminding you that you're not alone while simultaneously reinforcing how alone you are. You hear evidence of other lives, but you never touch them, never connect with them. They remain abstract. Ghosts in the machine. The galleries amplify everything. Hard surfaces everywhere. Stone floors, brick walls, iron railings, no carpets, no drapes, no soft materials to absorb vibration. Every sound bounces, multiplies. A single footstep becomes a dozen. A key turning in a lock becomes a gunshot. The architecture wasn't designed for acoustics, but it creates them anyway. Accidental amplification. The building becomes an instrument that plays a single note. Confinement, over and over, in every frequency. Exercise happens in partitioned yards. High walls dividing the space into individual rectangles. You walk in your rectangle. Another prisoner walks in his. You might be 10 feet apart, but you can't see him, can't speak to him, can't acknowledge his existence. You walk in a circle, or back and forth, depending on the size of your assigned space. You walk for the prescribed amount of time, fresh air, sunlight if the weather permits, and then you're returned to your cell. The outdoor time is measured in minutes, 30, sometimes less, depending on staffing, depending on the schedule, depending on variables you don't control and will never know. Back inside. Work resumes. The work is deliberately tedious. Picking oakum, unraveling old rope fiber by fiber until your fingers bleed. Stitching mailbags. Sewing buttons. Tasks designed to occupy time without requiring creativity or collaboration. Tasks that can be done alone, in silence with minimal supervision. The work isn't about production. It's about control. About filling hours. about ensuring you don't have idle time to plot, to plan, to imagine alternatives. Meals arrive through a slot in the door. You eat alone. The food is adequate, not good, not meant to be good. Adequate. Fuel. Calories measured to keep you functional, but not comfortable. Bread. Gruel. Occasionally meat. Water. You eat sitting on your stool at your small table in your 13 by 7 by 9 foot universe. You eat in silence. And when you're finished, the dishes go back through the slot. You don't see the person who brought them. You don't see the person who takes them away. You see only hands, institutional hands, the system's hands. The chapel happens twice on Sunday. Once in the morning, once in the afternoon. The wooden coffins fill. Prisoners arranged in tiers, all facing forward. The chaplain delivers his message. Scripture, warnings, promises. The vocabulary of salvation deployed like artillery. You are sinners. You can be saved. But salvation requires submission, requires penitence, requires the acceptance of authority not just from the prison but from God. The two become interchangeable. Obedience to the institution is obedience to divine will. Resistance to the system is resistance to your own redemption. The hymns are the strangest part. Music without community. Voices singing the same words but never harmonizing, never finding each other. Each voice isolated in its wooden box. The sound that emerges is fractured, dissonant. 100 men singing alone, at the same time, creating something that resembles worship but feels like mourning. Evening brings more work, more silence. The light through your high window shifts, fades. The cell darkens. Eventually the door locks. You hear the officer's footsteps retreat down the landing. The gallery settles, night descends, and you're alone again. Still. Always. This is the timetable. This is what reform looks like when reduced to schedule. Wake, work, walk, eat, chapel, sleep, repeat. 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year, for however long your sentence dictates. The theory is that in this monotony, in this relentless sameness, you'll find space to reflect, to change, to emerge different than you entered. The theory is wrong, but it takes time for the evidence to accumulate, for the pattern to become undeniable. But first, before the breakdown, the system has to perfect its tools, and one of its most effective tools is also its most absurd: a piece of brown cloth, cut and shaped to fit over a human face, tied behind the head with string, 2 holes for eyes, nothing else. A mask. Simple. Cheap. Utterly dehumanizing. When prisoners leave their cells for any group activity, walking to chapel, moving between wings, any moment where more than one prisoner might be visible at the same time, the masks come out. Officers distribute them. Orders are given. Put it on. Tie it. Now move. The official justification is the same as everything else in the separate system. Preventing recognition. Preventing the formation of criminal associations. If prisoners can't see each other's faces, they can't identify each other later, can't build networks, can't plan together. The mask is protective. It preserves the integrity of separation, even when physical proximity is unavoidable. But the mask does something else, something the designers maybe anticipated but never admitted. It strips identity, makes you anonymous, reduces you to a body, a shape moving through space, without personality, without history, without humanity. You wear the mask and you cease to be a person. You become a unit, a number, a thing the system moves from point A to point B. The humiliation is constant, low grade but relentless. You put the mask on and you feel it, the weight of it, the way it restricts breathing slightly, the way it marks you. You're not just a prisoner. You're a prisoner so dangerous, so contagious, that even your face has to be hidden. Even the sight of you could cause harm. Staff enforce it without sympathy. No talking. Eyes forward. Keep moving. The mask is mandatory. Refusal means punishment. And punishment at Pentonville has its own vocabulary. Loss of privileges, reduced rations, time in a darker cell, a special cell, the prison within the prison for those who won't comply with the prison's rules. The system isn't just isolation, it's identity stripping. The slow, methodical process of taking everything that makes you an individual and filing it away. Your name becomes a number, your face becomes a mask, your voice becomes silence, your time becomes not yours. Your space becomes borrowed. Your existence becomes conditional. You are reformed not by becoming better, but by becoming less complicated, less individual, less human, until what remains is compliant, manageable, safe. And yet, despite all this, despite the masks and the walls and the silence, humans find ways to be human. Humans communicate. Humans resist. Not always through grand gestures, not through riots or violence, through small acts, clever acts, acts that exploit the gaps in even the most carefully designed system. The prison's infrastructure becomes a communications network. The pipes, the ventilation shafts, the plumbing that connects cell to cell through the building's hidden circulatory system. The designers installed modern sanitation. Each cell gets a water closet, not a bucket, not a communal latrine, a proper toilet. This was progressive, hygienic, a demonstration of the prison's commitment to health and cleanliness, proof that separate confinement didn't mean medieval squalor. But pipes carry more than waste. They carry sound. Tap on a pipe in your cell and the sound travels. It reaches other cells. It becomes code, patterns, rhythms, messages. Prisoners develop systems, ways of asking questions, answering, sharing information, warning each other about officers, about searches, about anything worth knowing. The toilets themselves become drop points. Small items can be flushed, not to disappear, but to float through the system to another cell. Notes, contraband, whatever can fit and survive the journey. It's not reliable. It's not sophisticated. But it works often enough to matter. Often enough to prove that the prison's control isn't absolute, that the building has vulnerabilities, that the same modernity that was supposed to perfect isolation also creates holes. The administration catches on. Of course they do. They're not stupid. They're monitoring for exactly this kind of ingenuity. They inspect pipes. They listen for tapping. They search cells more thoroughly. And when prevention fails, they redesign. The private toilets go away, replaced with communal recesses, shared facilities, less modern, less hygienic, more medieval. The prison degrades itself to close the exploit. The smell changes. The experience of using a toilet becomes public, humiliating. You're back to older forms of degradation. But at least the pipes can't carry messages anymore. At least the system has regained control over that particular vector. Except now the atmosphere has changed. The prison marketed itself as enlightened, as modern, as proof that punishment could be humane and still effective. Taking away private sanitation, downgrading to the kind of facilities that characterize the chaotic jails Pentonville was supposed to replace, that's admitting something. That the model has flaws. That control matters more than comfort. That when forced to choose between the prisoner's dignity and the system's integrity, the system wins. This is the first major lesson. Humans will use infrastructure against you. They will find the gaps, exploit the features you thought were safeguards, turn your advantages into their tools. And when they do, you have two options. Adapt the system, or admit the system can't work as designed. Pentonville chooses adaptation. Always adaptation. The blueprint must be preserved. So when the pipes become problems, remove the pipes. When prisoners communicate, increase surveillance. When isolation proves insufficient, increase isolation. The logic is circular but unbreakable. The system exists to produce reform. If reform isn't happening, the system needs strengthening, not questioning. The chaplain's role expands. Cell visits increase. Moral instruction becomes more frequent. The chapel services grow longer, more intense. The pressure on each prisoner to demonstrate penitence, to show progress, to perform reformation, that pressure becomes enormous. Because if you don't show progress, the system has failed. And the system cannot be allowed to fail. So either you're improving, or you're lying about not improving, or you're so damaged that nothing can help you. The system creates no space for the possibility that the system itself might be the problem. Officers watch for signs, not just of rule breaking, of breaking, cracks in composure, strange behaviors, talking to oneself, sudden outbursts, long periods of staring at walls, refusal to eat, refusal to work, anything that suggests the prisoner is deteriorating rather than improving. At first, these signs are interpreted as malingering, as manipulation, as prisoners trying to game the system, pretending to be unwell to gain sympathy, to be moved to the infirmary, to escape the cell. The assumption is that compliance with the system should be neutral or positive, that the discipline of separation, while difficult, is ultimately beneficial. Like medicine, bitter but curative, but the signs keep appearing. And they start appearing in prisoners who have no obvious incentive to fake symptoms, who have no disciplinary history suggesting manipulation, who are, by all official measures, complying perfectly with the routine, following orders, doing the work, attending chapel, saying the right things to the chaplain, and still cracking. The symptoms are consistent: hysteria, panic attacks, dissociation, long periods of non-responsiveness followed by sudden, violent agitation, self-harm, not in dramatic ways, subtle ways, scratching its skin until it bleeds, pulling out hair, biting the inside of the mouth, small acts of violence against the self that accumulate into visible damage. Men leave separate confinement after their prescribed period, sometimes 9 months, sometimes 18, sometimes longer depending on the sentence, and they're not reformed, they're hollowed out. They can't make eye contact, can't hold conversations, struggle to be around other people. The very thing the system was supposed to prevent, the contamination of criminal association, has been replaced with something worse: social inability, psychological scarring, a learned inability to exist in human company. The prison faces a problem. The evidence is accumulating. Officers see it. The medical staff sees it. Even the chaplains, despite their institutional loyalty, can't ignore it. The separate system correlates with mental collapse, not in every case, but in enough cases to suggest a pattern, a causal relationship. The reform tool is producing reformed men. Yes, but reformed in the wrong direction. Reformed into something fragile, damaged, less able to function in society than before. This should trigger a reckoning, an honest evaluation, a willingness to admit that the theory, however elegant, doesn't match the reality, that humans don't respond to prolonged isolation the way the model predicted. That psychological harm isn't just a risk, it's an outcome, a feature, not a bug. But that reckoning doesn't happen, can't happen, because too much is invested, politically, financially, ideologically. Pentonville isn't just a prison, it's a proof of concept, a demonstration to the world that Britain has solved the problem of punishment, that enlightened governance can transform criminals without resorting to brutality. The building itself is an argument, and arguments don't like to be disproven, so the evidence gets reframed. The problem isn't the system. The problem is the men. They arrived damaged. They arrived weak. The prison didn't break them. They were already broken. The system revealed their brokenness, exposed it, made it visible, but didn't create it. Discipline is prioritized over treatment, because admitting that treatment is needed means admitting that harm is occurring, and admitting harm means questioning the design. And questioning the design means acknowledging that the model, the exportable, scalable, repeatable model, might be fundamentally flawed, that the tens of thousands of pounds spent, the reputation built, the international attention garnered, all of it might rest on a foundation of inflicted suffering rather than enlightened reform. The system protects itself, not through conspiracy, not through malice, Through bureaucracy. Through the simple institutional logic that says, we have invested too much to admit error. We have promised too much to acknowledge failure. We will adapt. We will modify. We will find explanations that preserve the core principle while addressing the visible problems. So modifications happen, quietly, not announced as corrections but as improvements. The length of time in strict separation gets adjusted for some prisoners, vulnerable cases, young offenders, those showing early signs of distress. They get moved to less restrictive wings, given more work outside the cell, more interaction, not as a rejection of the separate system but as a refinement, a demonstration of the prison's flexibility, its responsiveness. The paperwork changes, reports get worded carefully, symptoms are documented but attributed to individual weakness rather than systemic pressure. The language of reform remains unchanged. The prison still describes itself as humane, progressive, successful. The statistics cited in official reports emphasize compliance rates, work output, number of religious conversions, number of prisoners who expressed remorse. The metrics chosen are the ones that support the narrative. Meanwhile, inside the cells, time continues to do its work. Slow, measured, relentless. The walls don't change, the routine doesn't vary, the silence presses down. And some men break, and some men endure, and some men learn to hide their breaking so well that they pass the evaluations, demonstrate progress, get released, and carry the damage with them into the world. This is the prison's real innovation, not architectural, bureaucratic. The ability to absorb evidence of harm without admitting it, to reframe failure as individual rather than systemic, to maintain the model's reputation while quietly undermining its principles, to say one thing in reports and do another thing in practice, to be both the cause of suffering and the institution that denies causing it. Decades pass. The building ages. The ideology persists. And the machine keeps running. Because machines, once built, are expensive to dismantle, easier to keep operating, to maintain, to tweak when necessary but never fundamentally redesign. The Victorian commitment to rational reform becomes a Victorian commitment to institutional preservation. The blueprint, once drawn, becomes permanent. Not because it works, but because admitting it doesn't work costs more than pretending it does. The 20th century arrives and Pentonville remains. Still standing, still operating, still shaped by assumptions drawn up in the 1840s by men who believed geometry could cure deviance. The building hasn't changed much, some repairs, some updates to mechanical systems, but the fundamental architecture, the 4 radiating wings, the central hall, the cells designed for isolation, that stays the same. Because buildings once constructed resist transformation. They're easier to maintain than to reimagine, easier to patch than to rebuild. But everything around the building changes. London grows, the city sprawls, Caledonian Road becomes busier, more traffic, more noise. The prison, which once stood as a monument to modern governance, now just looks old, Victorian, a relic that happens to still be in use. The ideology that built it, the confident belief in reform through isolation, that's aged too. People don't talk about separate confinement the same way anymore. The language has shifted, the justifications have evolved, but the cells remain, 13 by 7 by 9. The same dimensions housing different bodies, different crimes, different decades. The prison's role shifts. It's no longer the flagship demonstration of a revolutionary system. It's become a workhorse, a local prison, taking remand cases, short sentences, overflow from other institutions. The careful selection process that once governed admissions, choosing prisoners deemed suitable for the separate system, monitoring their progress, treating each case as a study in moral transformation, that's gone. Replaced by the brutal efficiency of volume processing. Bodies come in, bodies go out. The machine runs faster, hotter, with less attention to the theory that once justified every architectural choice. Maintenance becomes an afterthought. The building's body starts showing its age. Windows don't seal properly anymore. Damp creeps in through old mortar. The drainage systems, those same pipes that prisoners once used for communication, they clog more frequently. Smell becomes part of the atmosphere. Not overwhelming, just present, constant. The smell of old stone and iron and too many people living in too little space for too long. The cells that were designed for one man now sometimes hold two. Not officially, not as policy, but as necessity. When the population exceeds capacity, when there's nowhere else to put someone, you double up. You put a second bed in a 13 by 7 space. You make it work. You tell yourself it's temporary, just until numbers drop, just until transfers clear. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when nobody's watching. When nobody's measuring whether the promise of separate confinement is being kept. When the only metric that matters is, did we find a place to put him? The Victorian dream of isolation as therapy becomes the 20th century reality of crowding as management. The prison doesn't reformulate its mission, doesn't announce that the separate system has been abandoned, it just quietly stops practicing what it preaches. The paperwork still references reform. The official descriptions still cite the prison's historic commitment to rehabilitation, but inside, on the landings, in the cells, the reality is different, grimmer, more focused on containment than transformation, on getting through the day than changing lives. And then in 1925, the machine experiences its first major public embarrassment. Not a riot, not a mass escape, something smaller but more revealing. 2 prisoners, 2 cells, 1 wall, and a pair of scissors. Arthur Bacon and Sidney Morris Marks. The names matter because they stop being numbers and become a story that makes newspapers, that makes people ask questions about how secure this supposedly impregnable Victorian fortress actually is. They're housed in adjoining cells, 3rd floor. The details of how they got there, whether it was intentional placement or administrative chance, those details are lost to time. What's known is that at some point they realize they're neighbors, and that the wall between them is old, and that old brick, when you have time and motivation and the right tool, can be compromised. The scissors are contraband, smuggled in, hidden, passed through networks that exist despite the prison's best efforts to prevent exactly this kind of coordination. Small scissors, the kind you might use for trimming thread. Nothing dramatic, nothing that looks like a weapon, which is why they got through, why they survived searches, why they ended up in a cell where they could become something else. Not a weapon, a tool, a key. They work at night. Obviously, when the landings are quiet, when the officers have reduced patrols, when the building settles into its nighttime rhythm. They work slowly, carefully, scraping mortar, loosening bricks, creating a hole large enough for communication first, then large enough for passing objects, then large enough for a human body to fit through. The work takes time, days, maybe weeks. The timeline isn't recorded with precision. What's recorded is the result. A breach. Cell to cell. A connection where separation was supposed to be absolute. They don't stop there. That's what makes the story significant. They don't just create a hole between cells and consider that success. They use it as the first step in a larger plan. Escape. Not just psychological escape, the temporary relief of human contact, but physical escape. Getting out. Over the wall. Into London. Into freedom. The engineering is improvised but effective. They tear their bedclothes, not randomly, methodically, creating strips, braiding them, testing tensile strength, making rope, soft materials turned into load-bearing hardware. The Victorian reformers would have been horrified not just by the escape attempt, but by the ingenuity, by the proof that their carefully controlled environment, their system designed to prevent criminal contamination, had instead created conditions where prisoners had nothing to do but think, plan, collaborate despite all attempts to make collaboration impossible. Approximately 25 feet. That's the drop from the 3rd floor window to the ground. Not survivable if you fall. Survivable if you have rope. They fashion it. Secure it to something inside the cell. Furniture, maybe. or the bars of the window. The records don't specify. What they do specify is that the rope holds, that both men descend, that they reach the ground inside the prison's outer perimeter without raising an alarm. Now they face the wall, the outer wall, 10 feet high, brick, topped with whatever anti-climbing measures were standard in Victorian prison design. This should be the end of the attempt, should be where the escape fails, where they realize they've gotten this far but can't get further, where they give up or get caught. They don't give up. They look around, find tubs, large washing tubs, made of metal or wood, heavy, awkward, but stackable. They stack them, build a platform, crude scaffolding, just tall enough to reach the top of the wall, just stable enough to hold weight for the seconds it takes to climb, to pull yourself up, to drop down the other side into Caledonian Road, into the night, into London, and they make it, both of them, over the wall, away from the prison. The alarm doesn't trigger until morning, until roll call, until officers move down the landing, opening doors, counting bodies, and find cells that should contain prisoners instead containing holes. Torn bedding, evidence of planning, evidence of success. The institutional embarrassment is profound, not just because 2 men escaped, because the escape revealed vulnerabilities in a system that prided itself on absolute control. The overnight patrols reported all well. The checks were performed, the procedures were followed, and yet 2 prisoners managed to breach a wall, descend 3 stories, scale an outer barrier, and escape into the city. The system that assumed compliance failed when confronted with planning. The manhunt that follows is less interesting than the questions that precede it. How did they get scissors? How long were they working before anyone noticed? What does it mean that the prison's control is procedural rather than absolute? That it relies on prisoners respecting the rules? That when someone decides not to respect the rules, the building's physical security isn't actually sufficient? The prison responds the way institutions always respond to embarrassment, with tightening, more restrictions, more frequent searches, more surveillance, more pressure. The machine closes like a fist. Not around Bacon and Marx, they're gone, eventually recaptured but gone from Pentonville, but around everyone else, around the prisoners who didn't attempt escape, who were following the rules, who are now subject to increased scrutiny because 2 men expose the system's limits. This is the pattern. Challenge leads to restriction. Restriction leads to pressure. Pressure leads to more reasons to challenge. The cycle self-reinforces. The prison becomes harder, less flexible, more paranoid. Security becomes the overriding concern. Not reform, not rehabilitation. Security, keeping people in. Preventing repetition of embarrassment. Maintaining the illusion of total control even after that illusion has been publicly shattered. But tightening has costs. When you increase restrictions, you increase tension. When you increase surveillance, you increase the feeling of being violated. When you treat everyone as a potential escape risk because 2 people escaped, you create an atmosphere where escape starts to seem reasonable, justified. The system's response to being challenged is to give people more reason to feel challenged by the system. Decades pass again. The scissors incident fades into institutional memory. Becomes a story officers tell new recruits, a cautionary tale. The prison moves forward, takes in more prisoners. The population continues to grow. The building doesn't expand. Can't expand. It's hemmed in by London, by property lines, by the Victorian footprint that determined its maximum size. 520 cells. That number was supposed to be sufficient. Was calculated based on assumptions about crime rates and sentencing patterns and the need for this particular type of institution. The assumptions were wrong. Crime doesn't stabilize. Sentencing doesn't rationalize. The need grows, and when need exceeds capacity, something has to give. In Pentonville's case, what gives is the principle, the original promise. 1 man, 1 cell, isolation as a designed intentional feature. That gives way to doubling, tripling, whatever it takes to accommodate the bodies that keep arriving. The prison's identity mutates. It's no longer the separate system's flagship. It's a local prison handling remand cases, people awaiting trial, people serving short sentences, people who cycle in and out too quickly for any meaningful intervention. The long-term isolation that supposedly produced penitence, that's gone, replaced by short-term containment. Holding pens. The architecture remains the same, but the use case has completely changed. The operational load becomes overwhelming. Different categories of prisoners requiring different kinds of management. Remand cases need access to legal representation. Short sentence cases need classification for work details. Vulnerable prisoners need separation from general population. Drug addiction cases need medical oversight. Mental health cases need psychiatric assessment. All these different needs, all these different protocols, all crammed into a building designed for one purpose, one approach, one kind of prisoner who no longer exists in the numbers that would justify the design. The galleries that once hosted silent processions of isolated men now host noise, shouting between cells, arguments, the sound of overcrowding, the acoustic properties of the building, those hard surfaces that amplify everything. They turn the noise into assault. Constant, invasive. You can't escape it even in your cell, because the walls that were supposed to prevent sound transmission were built, assuming one person per cell, assuming quiet, assuming order. They weren't built for this, for volume, for chaos. The maintenance backlog grows. Things break and don't get fixed immediately. Sometimes don't get fixed at all. Windows that don't close properly in winter. Heating systems that work in some wings but not others. Plumbing that backs up. Electrical systems that date from when electricity was new and now strain under demands they were never designed to handle. The building itself becomes part of the punishment, not intentionally, just through neglect, through the gradual accumulation of deferred maintenance. And then there are the vermin, mice, rats, insects. They find their way in through cracks, through gaps, through the building's aging envelope. They nest in walls, in ceiling spaces, in the hidden infrastructure. Prisoners report them. Officers acknowledge them. Nothing changes, because dealing with vermin requires money, requires contractors, requires someone deciding that prisoner welfare matters enough to budget for it. And that decision keeps getting deferred. The cells get filthy, not because prisoners are dirty, because the facilities are inadequate for the population, because cleaning supplies are limited, because time for cleaning is limited, because when you're running a building past capacity, something has to give, and what gives is usually the things that aren't immediately visible, the things that don't cause riots, the things that just make daily existence more miserable, more degrading, more medieval. Exercise time gets cut. Not officially, not as policy, but practically. When you have too many prisoners and not enough staff and not enough space in the yards, you reduce the time each person gets outside. 30 minutes becomes 20. 20 becomes 15. Sometimes less. Sometimes none. If there's a lockdown, if there's an incident, if staffing shortages mean you can't supervise yard time safely, the reasons are always operational, always justified, always temporary, until temporary becomes normal. The Victorian promise of reform through isolation becomes the 21st century reality of harm through overcrowding. But the prison doesn't admit this, doesn't announce that it's failing, doesn't declare that the model has collapsed. It continues operating, continues processing people, continues filing reports that describe conditions as adequate or acceptable, or whatever word makes the situation sound manageable, until July 2025, when the accumulated failures become too visible to ignore, when the monitoring bodies issue an urgent notification, when the state itself admits, in bureaucratic language designed to minimize impact, that Pentonville is losing, that the prison has serious failures, that people at risk of self-harm aren't being adequately supported, that the conditions have deteriorated to the point where official intervention is required. The notification doesn't use dramatic language, doesn't say the prison is a crisis, doesn't call it inhumane. uses phrases like serious concerns and insufficient support and requires improvement. The language is careful, measured, designed to acknowledge problems without admitting catastrophe, because admitting catastrophe means accepting responsibility, means facing questions about how things got this bad, means potentially having to do something radical, something expensive, something that challenges the entire logic of maintaining Victorian prisons in modern cities. The Independent Monitoring Board's year report provides details: overcrowding, filthy, vermin-infested cells, restricted activity, and deaths, multiple deaths, enough deaths in 1 year that the monitors felt compelled to mention it explicitly, to warn that the prison's conditions correlate with self-harm, with suicide, with preventable tragedies that keep happening because the system can't or won't address the underlying problems. The report describes people confined for extreme hours, 22 hours a day, not in the Victorian separate system, not as designed isolation meant to produce penitence, as accidental isolation, as a side effect of understaffing, of capacity failure, of a prison that can't manage the population it's been given with the resources it's been allocated. The isolation that the Victorians justified as therapeutic returns as purely punitive, as something that happens to you because the system is broken, because there's nowhere else to put you, because nobody's figured out an alternative. The horror isn't intentional. That's what makes it worse. If the prison were actively trying to harm people, you could protest the intention, could demand change in policy. But when the harm is structural, when it's the result of overcrowding plus understaffing, plus aging infrastructure, plus deferred maintenance, plus budget constraints, plus political indifference, there's no single villain to confront. No one decision to reverse. Just a system grinding forward, producing suffering not through malice but through inertia. Pentonville was built as a model, a demonstration that rational design could manufacture moral reform, that isolation could cure criminality, that science could be applied to punishment with enlightened results. The model failed. The evidence accumulated over decades, the mental breakdowns, the suicides, the way prolonged isolation damaged people rather than improving them. And the response wasn't to abandon the model, but to maintain the building, to keep using it, to adapt it for new purposes while keeping the old structure, until the old structure itself becomes the problem, until the Victorian geometry can't accommodate modern needs, until the prison designed to hold 520 isolated souls ends up crushing more people than that through overcrowding, neglect, and the simple passage of time. And still, it operates. Still processes people, still stands on Caledonian Road as a functioning institution. Because closing it would be expensive, relocating prisoners would be complicated, building a replacement would require investment, and investment requires political will, and political will requires public pressure, and public pressure requires visibility, and the prison's failures, while documented by monitors and advocates, remain largely invisible to the people who don't have to think about prisons, who don't have to enter them, who benefit from the service prisons provide, keeping certain people out of sight without having to confront the cost of that service. The urgent notification hangs in the air, unresolved. The prison continues. The monitors continue monitoring. The deaths continue accumulating, and Pentonville persists, not because it works, but because it exists. And things that exist are easier to maintain than to dismantle, easier to manage than to replace, easier to defend than to critique. The model failed, but the building remains. And the building, more than any theory or justification, is what determines the lives of the people inside it. The prison outlives its purpose, but not its presence. Pentonville in the 21st century exists in a state of contradiction. Officially, it's a Category B local prison, remand, short sentences, a processing center for North London's criminal justice machinery. That's the bureaucratic description, the functional reality. But underneath that, in the bricks and the iron and the geometry, it remains what it always was, a Victorian monument to the belief that architecture could reform souls, a model prison that failed at being a model but succeeded at being permanent. Stand outside on Caledonian Road now, and the building still watches you, the same way it watched people in 1842. The symmetry hasn't changed. The radiating wings still extend from the central hall. The cells still occupy the same positions in space they've always occupied. What's changed is the context. The world around the prison has moved forward. The prison has stayed still. And that stillness becomes its own form of violence, because time doesn't stop just because a building refuses to evolve. Inside, the split is evident. Walk the galleries and you're moving through Victorian infrastructure. The iron railings, the brick walls, the narrow landings designed for single-file processions of masked prisoners, the acoustic properties that amplify every sound, the sight lines that were calculated to enable surveillance, all of it preserved. Not because it works, because it costs less to maintain than to replace, but the use case has completely transformed. The prisoners aren't wearing masks anymore. The isolation isn't ideological anymore. The chapel doesn't operate as a centerpiece of moral reform. The system has abandoned the pretense that this building serves its original function. Yet the building remains, forcing modern populations into Victorian containers, forcing contemporary problems, mental health crises, addiction, gang violence, remand processing, into cells designed for a completely different kind of incarceration. The prison markets itself through heritage, through history. When you need to justify keeping a failing institution operational, you emphasize its historic significance, its architectural importance, its role in the evolution of criminal justice. You turn failure into legacy. You reframe obsolescence as tradition. The narrative shifts from "this prison reforms criminals" to "this prison is historically important," from function to identity, from performance to presence. And the presence is undeniable. Pentonville has become part of London's criminal justice geography. Courts send people there. Police know it. Lawyers reference it. Families visit it. It functions as a node in a network. Remove the node, and the network has to reorganize, find new capacity, redistribute populations. The logistical complexity of closure becomes an argument for continuation. Not because the prison works, because the system has organized itself around the assumption that the prison exists. This is how institutions persist, past their usefulness, through dependency, through the gradual accumulation of connections that make them seem irreplaceable, through the transformation of a building into infrastructure. Infrastructure that people rely on not because it's good, but because it's there. Because alternatives require investment, require planning, require someone making the decision that change is worth the cost. But to understand what Pentonville costs, what it truly costs beyond the budget lines and maintenance figures, you have to return to the cell, to the sensory experience of being held inside this machine, to the intimate weapons the building deploys against the people it contains. Sound is the first weapon, constant, inescapable. The building functions as an amplifier, every noise multiplied by hard surfaces, every conversation turned into public broadcast whether you want it to be or not. The slam of a door in one wing echoes across the entire floor. Keys jangling approach from distance, growing louder, announcing authority before authority arrives. The scrape of furniture, the flush of toilets, the shout of a name being called, the mechanical buzz of locks engaging. You can't filter it, can't turn it down, can't create silence because silence doesn't exist in the prison's acoustic environment. Even at night, when movement stops, there's sound. Ventilation systems, distant voices, someone coughing 3 cells away, the building breathing, creaking, settling, the sound of age working on materials, of strain working on structures. And underneath all the mechanical noise, there's the human noise, the invisible chorus, prisoners talking to each other through walls, through doors, through the spaces the building can't completely seal. Staff communicating, orders being given, the constant low-level conversation that happens in any institution where hundreds of people exist in proximity. But the proximity is strange. You hear people constantly. You rarely see them, voice without face, presence without connection. The building creates a kind of acoustic intimacy that never translates to actual human contact. This does things to you. Over time, your nervous system adapts to constant noise by becoming hypervigilant. Or it shuts down, stops processing. You learn to function in chaos by becoming numb to it. But the numbness costs something. Your ability to exist in normal acoustic environments degrades. The skill of filtering background noise, of focusing on relevant sound while ignoring irrelevant sound, that skill atrophies. You exit the prison, and normal conversation becomes overwhelming, or too quiet. Your baseline has shifted. The building has trained you to expect noise, to need it as proof that things are normal. Its absence becomes disturbing. The keys are the worst, the most consistent sonic signature of institutional control. Every officer carries a large ring of keys, heavy, metal. They jangle with every step. You hear them coming long before you see who's coming. The sound announces authority, announces the power to open or close doors, to grant or deny access, to interrupt or permit. The keys become a symbol, but they're also just noise, relentless, invasive, a reminder every few minutes that you exist in a controlled environment, that nothing happens without someone else's permission. Gates are the second sonic marker. The prison is full of gates, dividing wings, dividing floors, dividing areas by security level. Every gate is heavy metal. Every gate closing sounds like finality. A hollow boom that resonates through the galleries. You move through the prison and you're constantly aware of gates closing behind you, sealing you into progressively smaller segments of space. Each closure a reduction in freedom. Each opening a temporary relief that you know will be followed by another closure. The building trains you through sound, teaches you to respond to acoustic cues. The breakfast bell, the work detail call, the count announcement, the sound of your cell door unlocking. You develop Pavlovian responses. Certain sounds mean certain things, trigger certain actions. You become mechanized, responsive to signals, operating according to the building's rhythm rather than your own internal sense of time or need. Which brings us to the other weapon, the one that hurts more than sound. Time, not just the passage of time, the weaponization of time, the transformation of hours and minutes into instruments of control and suffering. 22 hours. That's the number that appears in recent reports, the number of hours per day some prisoners spend locked in their cells, not as punishment for infractions, not as designed isolation meant to produce penitence, as default, as the standard condition created by understaffing and overcrowding. 22 hours locked, 2 hours out, if you're lucky, if staffing permits, if there's no incident requiring lockdown. Do the math. 22 hours in a 13 by 7 foot space, with another person if the cell is doubled, with aging infrastructure, with limited ventilation, with a toilet that might not work properly, with vermin that might visit at night, with noise penetrating from all directions, with nothing to do except wait, exist, endure. 2 hours out means exercise if you're lucky, or phone time, or shower, or legal consultation if you're on remand, or medical appointment if you're sick, but not all of those things. You choose. Or the system chooses for you based on priorities that aren't explained, based on availability that isn't guaranteed, based on staffing levels that fluctuate day to day. Time stops being sequential, stops being something that moves forward. It becomes thick, congealed. You're not moving through time. You're trapped in it. The day doesn't have structure the way normal days have structure. It has interruptions, brief moments when the cell door opens and something happens, and then the door closes again and you're back in suspension, waiting for the next interruption, the next brief engagement with something that isn't the cell. This is worse than the Victorian isolation. At least the Victorian system had a theory, had structure, had a schedule that filled time with prescribed activity. Work in your cell, specific hours, chapel at specific times, exercise at specific times. The day was controlled, but it was filled. You knew what was supposed to happen when. You had expectations. The modern version offers no such structure. You're locked because the system can't manage otherwise. Not because isolation serves a purpose, because capacity and staffing create conditions where movement becomes impossible, where the safest, easiest option is to keep everyone contained, to reduce risk by reducing interaction, to manage populations by minimizing their ability to create problems. The tragedy is cyclical. The prison can't afford adequate staffing, can't afford to maintain the building properly, can't afford to run programs that give prisoners purposeful activity. So prisoners spend more time locked, more time idle, more time in conditions that breed frustration and mental health deterioration, which increases self-harm risk, which increases violence risk, which requires more lockdowns, more restrictions, more control, which requires more staff, which costs more money, which the prison doesn't have. So the cycle continues, worsens, feeds itself, and people die. Not every day, not in dramatic fashion, but regularly enough that the monitors feel compelled to mention it, to include death counts in their annual reports, to warn that the prison's conditions contribute to preventable tragedies. The official language is careful, doesn't assign blame directly, talks about insufficient support for those at risk of self-harm, about concerns regarding safety measures, about need for improvement in mental health provision. But underneath the bureaucratic language, the reality is simpler. People who are vulnerable, who arrive at the prison already struggling with addiction, with trauma, with mental illness, they enter an environment that makes everything worse, that provides minimal support, minimal therapeutic intervention, minimal human contact that isn't transactional. They get locked in cells for 22 hours. They get minimal exercise. They breathe air thick with the atmosphere of institutional failure. And some of them decide, or reach a point where their brain decides for them, that they can't continue, that the pain of existing in these conditions exceeds their capacity to endure it. The prison processes these deaths with paperwork. Every death triggers a review, an investigation, recommendations. The Independent Prisons and Probation's Ombudsman examines the circumstances, identifies failures, suggests improvements. The reports get filed. The recommendations get noted. And then, in most cases, implementation stalls. Because implementation requires resources, requires changes to practice, requires accountability, requires someone deciding that preventing the next death matters enough to do things differently. A jury in a prior inquest found that failures to learn from previous deaths contributed to another death. Read that sentence slowly. Let it sink in. The prison knew things, had evidence, had been warned, had received recommendations, and still, another person died because the system didn't implement what it learned, didn't convert knowledge into practice, didn't close the gap between understanding the problem and solving it. This is institutional memory failure. The building remembers everything. Every cell has held countless prisoners. Every gallery has witnessed countless movements. The architecture is fixed, permanent. But the institution's ability to learn, to take lessons from failures and actually change, that's broken. That's the real crisis. Not just that bad things happen, that bad things keep happening, that the same failures repeat, that the same warnings get issued, that the same recommendations get made, and nothing fundamental changes. Because Pentonville isn't just one failing prison. It's a template, a design that got replicated, the model prison infection. Dozens of institutions built in the 19th century using the same basic principles, the same radiating wings, the same cell dimensions, the same architectural philosophy. Different cities, different names, but fundamentally the same building, the same Victorian assumptions about how to manage human beings encoded in brick and iron across the country. And most of them are still operating, still grinding through populations, still serving as heritage infrastructure for punishment, ancient buildings doing modern work, buildings that cost enormous amounts to maintain but even more to replace, buildings that governments can't afford to abandon but can't afford to truly fix. So they persist, limping forward, deteriorating slowly, becoming gradually more medieval while claiming to serve contemporary justice. The dystopia isn't one prison. It's replication. It's the fact that Victorian England built a failed experiment and then copied it 50 times, built it into the landscape, made it permanent, and now, nearly 2 centuries later, we're still living with the consequences, still sending people into buildings designed for a punishment philosophy we've supposedly abandoned, still expecting Victorian architecture to somehow produce modern outcomes. The model was supposed to demonstrate that rational systems produce rational results, that if you control enough variables, movement, contact, time, space, sound, you can control human behavior. You can manufacture reform. The Victorians were confident about this. Scientific. They measured everything, documented everything, ran the prison like an experiment with the prisoners as subjects and reformation as the hypothesis. The experiment failed. The evidence accumulated slowly but undeniably. The mental breakdowns, the deaths, the way isolation damaged people rather than improving them, the way the system's core assumption that removing social contact would allow individual moral reflection proved catastrophically wrong. Humans are social animals. Remove sociality and you don't get reflection. You get psychological collapse. You get trauma. You get damage that persists long after release. But here's what's remarkable. The failure didn't stop the replication, didn't prevent other prisons from being built using the same model. Because the people making decisions about prison construction weren't the same people witnessing the failures. The architects and the administrators and the politicians approving budgets, they were working from theory, from reports, from the marketed version of Pentonville that emphasized order and cleanliness and modernity. They didn't see the prisoners breaking, didn't hear the sounds of distress echoing through the galleries at night, didn't smell the fear and desperation that accumulated in cells over years. They saw a blueprint, and blueprints are reproducible, scalable. The promise of the model was that you could export success, build one working prison and then build 50 more just like it, stamp them out, fill the country with rational, modern, efficient institutions that would solve the crime problem through architecture. The promise was a lie, but the buildings are real, still standing, still operational, still processing human beings through Victorian machinery. The blueprint succeeded not at producing reform, but at producing buildings. Lots of buildings. All of them aging, all of them struggling, all of them evidence that copying a failed model 50 times doesn't make it work. Just makes the failure larger, more distributed, harder to address because now it's not one problem in one place. It's a structural problem embedded in the entire system. 84,186 pounds, 12 shillings, 2 pence. That's what Pentonville cost to build in 1842. Approximately 9 million in modern currency. Money spent to create a machine for manufacturing moral transformation. Money spent on a theory that proved false. Money spent on infrastructure that would outlast the ideology that justified it by more than a century. And Britain is still paying. Not in construction costs, in operational costs, in maintenance of ancient buildings, in the human cost of processing people through institutions that were never designed for their current purpose, in the generational cost of trauma inflicted by environments that damage as surely as they contain, in the political cost of defending a system everyone knows is broken, but nobody wants to bear the expense of replacing. The final question isn't whether Pentonville failed. That's obvious, documented, undeniable. The final question is whether it was ever meant to succeed, whether the stated purpose, moral reform through rational isolation, was ever the real purpose, or whether the real purpose was simpler, darker, more honest in its cruelty. Control. That's what the building does effectively. It controls. It contains. It removes people from society and holds them in conditions that make resistance difficult. It processes populations, manages bodies, maintains order not through transformation but through pressure, through the application of enough discomfort that people comply not because they've been reformed, but because compliance is the path of least resistance. Maybe that was always the point. Maybe the moral language, the penitence, the reform, the therapeutic isolation. Maybe that was just marketing. Just the story you tell to justify building machines for human containment. Just the way you make cruelty sound rational, scientific, enlightened. Maybe the Victorians knew exactly what they were building, a system that hurts people efficiently, systematically, with enough bureaucratic distance that no individual has to feel responsible for the aggregate suffering. Or maybe they genuinely believed. Maybe Captain Jebb really thought his design would transform criminals into citizens. Maybe the chaplains really believed that forced reflection would produce genuine penitence. Maybe the administrators really thought they were building something better than what came before. Something that would reduce crime, improve society, demonstrate Britain's commitment to rational governance. If they believed, they were wrong. And the wrongness echoes through time, through every prisoner who broke under separation, through every death that could have been prevented, through every recommendation that went unimplemented, through every year the building continues to operate despite overwhelming evidence that it shouldn't. The wrongness compounds, accumulates interest, becomes a debt that society owes but refuses to acknowledge. Pentonville stands on Caledonian Road. Will probably stand there for decades more. The walls won't collapse on their own. The system won't shut it down voluntarily. It will continue. Processing people, containing them, damaging some, releasing most. Operating in the gap between its historic identity and its contemporary function. Being neither the model it was designed to be, nor the modern institution it pretends to be. Just existing. Just grinding forward. Just being there because it's always been there and nobody's found the courage to imagine something else. The building watches, the geometry persists, the cells wait, and the machine runs. Not well, not ethically, not effectively, but consistently. Because that's what machines do once they're built. They run until someone switches them off, and nobody's willing to find the switch.